Well, once you get all your vector paths in place, you can actually share them with other products. So you might want to use them for print or for drawing, and maybe you're going to send them to InDesign or to Illustrator. So here's some ways that you can take these paths and share them. Here we go. Well, first of all, let's explore the idea of a clipping path. And we have all these different paths, and you could have as many paths as you want, but I've got one here that's complete. And a clipping path is used so that we can knock out the background and put them into a document, let's say an InDesign file, and suppress any of this background area so that all we have is the image itself, and it makes it easier for text flow as also putting it on some color background in the final product. What you do is you select the path, and it needs to be an actual path. It can't be a work path. It needs to actually be saved as named and saved as a path. And then when you come over here to your flyout menu or panel menu, you can create a clipping path. And you can actually pick from any of these paths here that you have saved, and I'm going to choose this one called complete. You can only have one clipping path. You designate the one that you want to use. And if you leave the flatness as blank, then the device or the output is going to figure it out for you. That's usually what I do. You could put a number in there, but I'm just going to leave it blank. That means auto. Click on OK. And now this file has been saved with the clipping path. And, well, ultimately, I got to save it. And I can actually, when I save it as, I could save it as a PSD file, or there's some other formats that do support clipping paths. For example, you could save it as a TIFF file. And I'm going to go ahead and choose cancel here and just give you an example of a file that uses clipping paths. Here's an example with the clipping path, and you can see not only is the text wrapping around it, but it's knocked out that background. And it's really important that you make a nice clean clip when you're creating that path. Otherwise, you're going to have a little bit of trace of white. And here's an example where there is no clipping path. And so in this scenario, Photoshop, or InDesign rather, just can't knock out the background. Now, this is an image with a clipping path, and you can see it was a nice clean image. And here's an example of an image without a clipping path, but it was set on a white background. And some products are able to knock out the white background, but when you use a clipping path, let me zoom in here a little bit. Oops, a little smaller there. I can actually use the same keyboard shortcuts to zoom in Acrobat that I can use in Photoshop, which is nice. So Control Space or Control Plus and Minus. But then it's a nice cleaner edge because I was able to go in Photoshop and really set up that path and really put some detail, maybe even contract it a little bit. Whereas when I use the default tools, let's say in InDesign or some other product, then there might be this halo effect. And if we move down here, here's another example with a clipping path. And this clipping path was actually done in the InDesign product using some of the features without having to try to do, trying to draw the path in Photoshop. It's going to be a little simpler maybe in Photoshop because you're taking advantage of all the raster tools in order to create that trace. And here's an example if there were no clipping path at all. Again, this image originally just had a white background, and you can see the white comes through. So the clipping path really makes it not just a tool for text wrap, but for knocking out the background so you can see behind it. Now, another feature you may want to take advantage of is once you've made this path, you may be wanting to turn this into a vector shape that you can use in a product like Illustrator, which really gives you a lot of advanced tools for drawing with vector tools or enhancing those vector paths. And so Photoshop allows you to go down to File, Export, Paths to Illustrator. It's going to save the file as an Illustrator file and simply as a path that then can be filled or put a stroke or whatever features you want to do. Incidentally, when you work with Illustrator in Photoshop, you can go the other way around. If you were to do a file open and you open up an Illustrator file, so for example, here is here's a path that was already saved, but here's an example. What happens is the paths will become rasterized in the Photoshop environment because that's how Photoshop thinks, so it's no longer truly an Illustrator file. However, if you were to use your mini bridge, and I'm going to use my mini bridge here, and you were to place a graphic, so for example, find some folders. Oh, here we go, projects. And find the folders with my logos in it. I think I went too far. There's my logos. There we go. And I was to open up this Illustrator file and just drag it in. When I bring it in, click on OK, it's actually bringing it as a smart object. I'll press Enter, and I look at my layers. I can see that's a smart object, which means that it still retains the Illustrator features, and if I were to double click on it, it would launch an Illustrator with all of its vector capabilities. And so I can resize it, and I can add some effects to it, and it's not going to change the quality of the image. Alternatively, you can also do the file place, and you can bring something in as a smart object that way. Now, might be an option where you want to take an item, maybe it's text or maybe it's a graphic, and you want to rasterize it. You can take smart objects and you can come down to the layer and you can rasterize them. Here we go, rasterize the smart object. You can also rasterize vector masks and types. And incidentally, when you save your files, there's going to be certain formats that will automatically rasterize the information. So for example, you save it as a JPEG, and that image is going to be turned into a bitmap image as opposed to a vector. So it's going to be resolution dependent, and you won't want to scale it too much beyond the final output. But while you're working in Photoshop, you have all these great tools to continue and create new iterations. Well, those are some features that you have that are available for you in Photoshop for working with your vector paths in other products like InDesign or Illustrator, or conversely bringing in products like Illustrator paths and putting them into Photoshop. Well, now it's time for a pop quiz. How do you save a Photoshop path as an Illustrator path? A, File, Save As, Paths to Illustrator. B, File, Export, Paths to Illustrator. C, File, Place, Paths to Illustrator. D, File, Convert, Paths to Illustrator. The answer is B, File, Export, Paths to Illustrator.